Just a little background from myself. I, along with my husband, Tomas Jain, began the African Aquatic Conservation Fund, our NGO, in 2014, after both of us had spent many, many years working for different nonprofits. And we started it to really focus on Africa's neglected species as we saw it. So manatees, turtles. Tomas is an African turtle specialist. He studies tortoises, freshwater turtles, and sea turtles in Africa with his collaborators. We also began the Senegal Stranding Network for sea turtles and marine mammals, mostly cetaceans. And we're very excited. We have a new partner joining us soon, Dr. Sal Cerchio, who works with cetaceans, particularly the Omura's whale in Madagascar. And he works in the Mozambique Channel as well. So those are the 4 programs of our organization at the moment. So I'm just going to give you guys some very general background information about manatees to start with, because there are people in Africa, hopefully not too many, but there are some people who believe that they are fish. They are not. They're mammals, just like us. They have hair. They give birth to live young. They nurse their young. And we have 4 living Sirenians. Sirenia is the order in the world today. And you can see them there. The Amazonian manatee is the smallest. It's black in color with a white belly patch that's unique to each individual. The West Indian manatee lives in Florida and the Caribbean and all the way down into the top of South America. And then the African manatee, which we actually no longer call the West African manatee because it was causing too much confusion between West and Central Africa and inland and coastal, people thinking that we had different species of manatee in Africa. So we actually call it the African manatee these days. And the dugong. The dugong is a closely related cousin that lives 100% in the marine environment from East Africa all the way across to Australia and Asia. They are different in that they have that dolphin-like tail. They don't come into freshwater ever, and their skin is much more like a dolphin, whereas the manatees have kind of a rougher skin, like an elephant, basically. And this is the global distribution of Sirenians. Oh, sorry, I skipped one important big guy at the bottom there. The stellar sea cow, which unfortunately is extinct. And you can see it was quite a large animal, and it lived in the, actually in the, off the Kamchatka Peninsula and in the Aleutian Islands off Africa. At one point, thousands of years ago, it lived all the way from Japan to Baja California along the rim of the Pacific. But it was hunted to extinction within 27 years of its discovery by seafarers in the 1700s. Initially, Stellar, who was his ship wrecked on an island, and they were starving and looking for food, and they found this giant animal eating the kelp nearby and butchered it for food. Then they were rescued, and they went home and told everybody else, and unfortunately they were hunted to extinction. So no more stellar sea cows, sadly. So the global distribution of the Sirenians that still exist is really tropical and somewhat subtropical. The Florida manatee and the purple there on the left, which is a subspecies of the West Indian manatee, can be found sometimes all the way up to Chesapeake Bay on the eastern seaboard in the United States. But regularly, they generally live in Florida. They cannot stand the colder temperatures of winter in the United States, and they need to be in warmer waters. Fortunately, in Africa, our manatees don't have a cold weather problem. It never gets cold enough for them to worry about that there. So you can just see the distribution of all of these different Sirenians. And I do want to point out that they evolved from an ancestor that was a sort of dog-sized, hippo-like ancestor that evolved in Africa. And one of their common they share a common ancestor with elephants. And you can imagine with the elephant grabbing food with their trunk that the manatees can use their snout in the same way as you can see in the picture on the left to grip plants and pull it into their mouths. And they are part of a large order called Afrotheria, mammals that all evolved in Africa, and part of a clade called Penangulata, which includes rock hyraxes, golden moles, aardvarks. So some very diverse critters in this order, and but they all share a common ancestor from millions of years ago. The first manatees, the first Sirenians evolved, the proto-Sirenians evolved about 55 million years ago in what was the Tethys Sea and is today the Mediterranean. And they spread out across the globe. And interestingly, the first fossils found of those proto-Sirenians were actually found in Jamaica. So we know they made it that far. It took a very long time to find any proto-Sirenian fossils in Africa, but some have been found in Senegal as well as Algeria. So just some general facts about African manatees. Of course, Africans knew they were there since time began and people were existing in Africa, but the first specimen for science was collected by the naturalist Michel Adanson from France in the mouth of the Senegal River in 1752. He spent many years in Africa, in Senegal, and the entire baobab genus is named Adansoni in his honor. He brought the specimen back to France, but unfortunately passed away before he could describe it in the scientific literature, so that honor went to Link in 1795. African manatees are smaller than the West Indian manatee that we have in the Caribbean and Florida. They're about 249 centimeters long at average length. They can get a bit bigger, but not a lot. And their weight is generally estimated by us because we have almost no accurate weight measurements for African manatees to date, but they probably range between 200 and 400 kilograms. So as I said, they resemble Florida manatees, but they are smaller. Their eyes are buggier, as people say. They protrude more, and they have some other cranial differences I won't get into, but if you picture a mini little manatee from Florida, that's basically very similar to what we have in Africa. Interestingly, and I have no, it's just anecdotal at this point, I have no scientific quantification of this, but what I've noticed over the last 14 years working with these guys is that in Gabon, they're very small. They're little mini manatees. The first time I saw a manatee in Gabon, I thought it was a subadult manatee and was told, no, that's an adult. That's as big as they get. Whereas in Senegal and Mali, the individuals are much larger in general and are almost about the length of a Florida manatee, but not as bulky, as round, because they don't need to bulk up for cold weather. So I suspect as time goes on and we get more research done, we may find some morphological differences in the Central African manatees versus the ones up in West Africa. Their lifespan is about 39 years, at least 39 years, possibly longer. Florida manatees can live to be 70 years old. And we know about the lifespan due to a study that I'm doing with ear bones that I will describe to you in a moment. But generally, we know very little about African manatees. They're very, very shy and elusive. They avoid people. You can see in the picture on the bottom left, the water can be like chocolate milk. So there's very little ability to see them in the water most of the time. The picture on the bottom right is one of about 10 pictures that exists of an African manatee underwater that were almost all taken during a study when we had a photographer with us in Gabon in 2009. So they're very elusive because they're heavily hunted and so very hard to study. So we know very little about their life history, their age of maturity, their home range, how often they have a calf, how long that calf needs to stay with its mother. And so they're, the two biggest threats for African manatees are poaching and fisheries bycatch. So meaning that they are the unintended target of fishing nets and get caught but are not released. They are almost always eaten when caught by fishermen, followed by human development and habitat destruction. So they are protected by law in all of the countries in which they exist. They exist in 21 different countries along the western side of the African continent. And unfortunately, most of the time, those laws are not enforced. So that's something we're working to change that I will be telling you about in a little while. They are classified as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List, but as the person who wrote the Red List assessment, I can tell you that I think that we just don't have the kind of information I wish we had for a more accurate classification. I suspect when we get more information, they may become endangered due to the level of threats against them in most of the places they live. They're also listed as an Appendix I species under the Convention for International Trade in Endangered Species and the Convention of Migratory Species, which is great, raises a lot of awareness, but those conventions unfortunately don't have many teeth involved in order to actually enforce laws. Those conventions work internationally, but not within countries where most of the problems are for African manatees. And one of the things that I find fascinating about them is that they live in this very wide range of habitats across their 21 country range. Everything from rivers in the Sahel, as you can see in the bottom left, that's looking from Senegal across the Senegal River to Mauritania during the dry season where they have only very shallow water and very little access to plants to eat, to Central African rainforests that are lush and flood their banks every rainy season, and the manatees are able to swim up into the flooded forests and eat probably some of the same foods and fruits that elephants are eating in the dry season, to oceanic, near coastal and mangrove environments and seagrass beds off the coast of many of the countries where they live. So this is a generalized map of their habitat, and you can see all the 21 countries. This map is really only showing some of the major rivers in West and Central Africa, but there are thousands and thousands of other rivers and lakes and estuaries and lagoons that are not on this map. So it's a very general overview, but it gives you an idea of where they live. And if you can look towards Mali and see the town of Koulikoro, manatees, we've had a manatee sample from Koulikoro. So they live over 3,000 kilometers inland from the ocean. And the recent work that we've done with some satellite tagging shows that they migrate potentially 150 to 200 kilometers. So once they got up these rivers, millennia ago, they probably live there, they don't migrate. And today they have problems, including dams. And these are showing you some of the major hydroelectric dams that block every major river in Africa except the Gambia River, and also dams that are under construction. And I would hasten to point out that these are only a few of the many dams under construction. There are some other large dams, particularly in Mali and the Bani River, that are blocking manatees into smaller and smaller chunks of riverine habitat, which is a problem because it makes them easier to hunt there and to kill them. So you can imagine that that's a problem, particularly in the Niger River, as they get more and more dams. But I do want to point out the scale here. So if you look at the Senegal River in the upper left, and you see there's two dams, the Jama Dam near the mouth and the Kai Dam in upper river in Mali. The length of river that the manatees have available to them between those two dams is longer than the state of Florida. So in other words, while they are locked between those two dams, there is the potential for them to have plenty of habitat in that location between those two dams. And we do find many manatees in the Senegal River. But I think as these rivers get chopped into smaller and smaller portions, it could become a problem. Particularly, you can see in Nigeria between the Kanji Dam and another dam just below it that I can't pronounce. It's a very small chunk of river. It's only 60 kilometers. So we also know that outside of Africa, many people don't really understand the true size of Africa. So this is a map that I always love to show in my talks, just to give people an idea of how truly large Africa is. And when we look at the range of the African manatee overlapped, it's almost the size of the continental United States. And within that range, we have maybe 35 people working with the species, where in Florida, all together with researchers and policymakers and law enforcement and everybody working with manatees, we have well over 1,000 people. So you just see this incredibly different scale of the size of what we're dealing with here in Africa and some of the challenges that we might face. So an overview of my project and where we're going to finish talking about tonight. My long-term study sites are Gabon and Senegal. I started out in Gabon in 2006 at the invitation of a whale researcher named Tim Collins, who I met at a conference, who told me, you know, you really should come to Africa. There are, manatees are supposed to be rare, but in Gabon, I see them almost every day as I traverse the lagoon on the way to my whale sites. And so I came to Gabon and fell in love with the manatees there and fell in love with Africa and sort of never looked back, basically. Spent the next 7 years in a boat in Gabon. But I've mostly passed the torch on my work in Gabon there to 2 students and a mentee that are there working on manatees. I relocated my base to Senegal in 2010 when I got engaged to my husband and have been working from there since. But I do work in other countries and have worked and have built collaborations in other countries as well. And you can see the list there. I'm also just about to start a project in Guinea-Bissau to lead, Guinea-Conakry to lead training and threat assessments in that country as well. So basically, when I started working with African manatees, there was so little known, and we didn't know how many occurred in almost any country, where they were, what was their important habitat, what kind of threats they were truly facing, what were the good places for them, what were the tough places for them. So I started out by doing countrywide distribution surveys, sitting in a boat, looking for them, trying to count them, and understanding threats and interviewing people as I went along about where they saw manatees, where they hunted, etc. Then I ended up moving on to genetics because I was convinced in about 2009 by a colleague in Florida, as he said, I could spend the next 35 years in a boat studying, trying to find manatees in these different rivers and not learn as much about the populations as I would in 4 years of genetics. So I did start doing genetic work, and I'm going to tell you something about the populations that we've learned. And a particular interest of mine has always been feeding ecology. How do animals feed themselves? How do they learn to find food when they're young? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the food that we know they eat. The age determination study, we wanted to know how long they live. And so following a protocol that's been used in Florida for many, many years, the manatee unfortunately has to be dead, but if they are, we can collect their ear bone and use a technique where it's sliced like the rings in a tree. And here you can see the rings in a stained slice of ear bone, and you can count across and literally age the manatee. And spoiler alert, in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide, you'll see it says age 16. So if you work at it, you can actually count 16 annual layers laid down in the ear bone of this manatee, just like the rings in a tree. And that's how we are able to age them. And so that's how we know that the oldest manatee to date is 39 years old. But as I said, we suspect that they could potentially live quite a bit longer. We also do conduct manatee rescues when we have stranded manatees. And a large part of our work is training programs for particularly African researchers to try to build capacity in as many countries as we can, get as many boots on the ground studying African manatees. Educational outreach, which I'm sure everyone knows is so important for teaching the next generation the importance of not only protecting manatees, but the marine environment and alternative livelihoods to try to stop some of the hunting as well. And then some various research projects that we design for specific countries and specific needs. So as I said, when I first started in Gabon, I went out, I sat in boats. I basically got really frustrated because I almost never saw a manatee. What I did see, the 2 pictures on the bottom are both taken in different parts of Gabon. So on the lower left, what you see is a tail swirl and a pressure wake as the manatee flees the boat. And sometimes if we stop the boat, they will circle around because they are generally very curious, and they'll come back and check out the boat. And we're able to get a count or some indication of a count. And another way that we can often see them, this is in a flooded forest opening in Gabon as well, in I'm trying to remember, the Rembobongo River, where a manatee swimming away, the action of its tail fluke against the bottom is putting up bubbles, so we can literally follow them by their bubble trail. They usually dodge into the underbrush pretty quickly. They know exactly how to escape from people, so they're very difficult to see. We can find them sometimes by feeding sign. They are messy eaters. They particularly like to eat roots, so they will uproot plants. As you can see with the taifa on the upper right, they've uprooted the thick stalks to eat the roots, or even in grasses, they will go into flooded grass areas and rip grasses up to get at the roots. Or in the bottom right, they'll just push in. If you actually have a laser pointer here, so I'm gonna show you if they sort of pushed into this area and eat the grass in this flooded grassland there. So as we went along, we opportunistically sampled as many manatees as we could when we were able to capture them for studies. When they died, we took samples. When they were needed rescuing, as in the upper right corner, I was able to not only collect samples, but train people how to rescue and sample and release them. And we also collected different food that they eat to try to determine what they were eating. But this is the reality, as I was talking about before. This is all of the rivers in Gabon. And so I very quickly became overwhelmed with, you know, this is just too many rivers. I'll never be able to survey all this. And then you add all the other countries in. I really have to do something else here to learn more quickly about the different manatee populations that may exist in West Africa and Central Africa. So that led me to the genetic research. And as I said, we really had no idea. You know, there was a very rough guesstimate that there were 10,000 manatees across the species range, across the 21 countries, but nobody had any idea of how many populations there might be. You know, what is the genetic diversity of those populations? Are the ones that are isolated by dams in trouble? Is hunting having an impact on populations? And I was also interested in the evolution of African manatees related to other species of manatees, but I'm not really going to touch on that today. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer them either in the chat or after the talk. But the goal of the genetics is obviously to make sure that we can conserve these creatures, because they are facing a lot of threats, and we really want to be able to protect them for the future. So my genetics work focused on taking tissue samples. You can see the tail in the bottom left corner. That's there's a little notch out of it where we actually use a cattle ear notcher to notch a piece of tissue out of the tail of a living manatee. It's not something anybody should go out and do. We have permits for this work. We also clean the area with betadine and alcohol to make sure that there's no infection before or after we cut the sample. And that's just something that we don't take lightly because we don't want to injure the animal. But for many years in Florida, they've used this technique, and with the proper training, it doesn't hurt the manatee. It's similar to getting your ear pierced. For dead manatees, of course, we can take other tissue like muscle, but we also have now started moving towards collection techniques where we don't even have to see the manatee at all, such as fecal samples, the poops that are floating on the surface of the water in places where we can find those, and even water samples for environmental DNA. We've been able to collect African manatee DNA from those, and that's really helping us to speed up our genetics work. So the work that we've done so far, particularly for my dissertation, has identified the first 4 populations, and you can see that they're quite large. So in the upper left, in the larger green circle, we've identified a population in the northern part of the range, including Senegal, Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, and Guinea. And nested within that population is a separate population in the Senegal River that has not interbred with the coastal population for at least 1 million years, which tells us that those manatees, their ancestors got in that river a very long time ago and stayed there, no surprise, because it's a nice freshwater system with food for them, and there's no other freshwater source south of that river for over 340 kilometers. And there's nothing north of that river that's fresh because you reach the Sahel Desert. So they pretty much locked themselves in the Senegal River. And there they are as a separate population. Then moving across to the very large blue sort of circle squiggle, that is what I call the sort of southern population. And so all the manatees from Cote d'Ivoire down through Gabon are more closely related to each other than they are to any manatees in Senegal or the northern population. And then again, nested within that population is the Niger River that is separate. And we have not as many samples as we'd like so far from the Niger River, but what we do have tells us that they also got into that river over 1 million years ago, swam way up the river, and now live in that river and will never return to the ocean, even if there weren't any dams. That's where they want to be. And also, I'd like to point out that you'll notice there's no samples from Angola or Democratic Republic of the Congo yet, so we still have to learn about those. So there is that current north-south population boundary showing there in Sierra Leone and Liberia. And we ran over 88 models so far, and that's showing us that these two populations, sort of the larger green and the larger blue, are separate. According to all the different models we ran, genetically they are 100% separate. However, having no samples from Sierra Leone and Liberia makes us wonder, is that a real population boundary? Are we going to see them somewhat merge once we have samples? The reason I don't have samples is because when I was out there collecting is when Ebola hit, and so I wasn't able to travel to those countries to collect samples, but I'm looking forward to going there in the near future. So this slide is a bit overwhelming, but I just wanted to show it just to show you that there is a lot of diversity. That's the take-home message. A lot of color means a lot of diversity. So what you're looking at here is roughly the same information from the previous slide, but broken out by country. And the circle sizes relate to the numbers of samples collected from each country. And this has changed. There's a lot more samples for Cameroon now, in particular. My student Aristide Kamla just graduated with his PhD and collected over 400 water samples. But these are tissue samples. And so the slices of the pie are showing different haplotypes. All you need to know about a haplotype is that it's a marker, a genetic marker that's inherited from a single parent. This is the mom in this case. This is a mitochondrial marker. And so I just want to show you that there's a lot of diversity in Africa. And if you compare this with the Florida manatee, they only have one color. They have one control region haplotype. So this is kind of exciting to see this level of diversity, and you can see that we don't have many samples from the Niger River yet. And so we expect to find more diversity there, as well as the countries where we have very few samples. Another thing to point out is in Senegal, where you see the large chunk of the pie that is navy blue. That is the Senegal River, and the other ones are the coast. So the Senegal River is all one haplotype, similar to Florida manatees. There's very little diversity there, which tells us that that population is going to need some protection, especially with climate change and desertification that may start to dry up rivers in the Sahel. That population could be at risk. So other than the fact that I just wasn't able to collect samples in Sierra Leone and Liberia, it seems the model seems strong to more strongly be saying that there is in fact a division in that area of the continent. And so we wanted to examine some of the geophysical potential barriers to why that might be. And so one reason may be that that area of Sierra Leone and Liberia is the convergence zone for many important currents running along the African coast, and even the northeast countercurrent, the large blue one coming across the Atlantic Ocean and basically hitting the African continent in that area, makes the ocean there very dynamic and rough. And manatees don't like dynamic and rough. They like calm waters. So they tend to stay away from areas with rougher ocean. Same thing for Gabon. In fact, just as an example, they don't go out in the ocean in Gabon. It's very rough there. They like to stay in the lagoons. So the currents are potentially one factor. Another factor is from the northern border of Sierra Leone down to the southern border, the continental shelf decreases from 145 kilometers wide to just 32 kilometers wide. And we already know from manatee studies in Puerto Rico and Cuba that manatees will avoid moving in areas of narrow continental shelf. They don't like it and they don't pass it, and we see genetic differences there in those island countries as well, where they are separated because of narrow continental shelf. So there may be a real reason, other than I just don't have samples, that there are these different populations in Africa. And it doesn't mean that no manatees are moving across this boundary. It just probably means that few want to. So moving along to the feeding ecology study that we're doing, why would we want to study diet? Well, aside from the fact that I just think it's really cool to know what animals are eating. As I mentioned, African manatees live in this very wide range of habitats from the desert to the rainforest, and so we would expect their diet to vary between different ecosystems. African manatees live in the widest range of ecosystems of any Sirenian. So this is kind of a no-brainer that obviously a manatee in a river in the Sahel is going to eat something different than a tropical rainforest. And as I mentioned, they're very difficult to study in the wild. You can see this picture on the lower left of 3 little manatee noses sticking up above the chocolate milk water. And those manatees were actually trapped behind a dam. They were rescued and they were trapped behind an agricultural dam in Senegal. And we wouldn't have seen those noses if they were not trapped behind that dam in relatively low water. So it just gives you an idea how hard they are to even see. African manatees eat over 90 different species of plants and counting. We're still identifying new species all the time. But as I went along and did my interviews in different countries, local people started reporting to me that they were also eating mollusks and fish throughout their range. And they're not chasing these fish down, they're taking them from fishing nets. And I was a bit skeptical at first, but you can see the picture in the bottom right of these gentlemen holding up catfish heads. They have an entire basket of catfish heads there left in their nets. They are in a tributary of the Senegal River in the dry season where there's literally no other animal large enough to do that. There are no crocodilians, there are no turtles, there are nothing. There's nothing large enough except the manatees that get trapped every year in that tributary during the dry season to be taking those fish. And so that's the first place where I was truly convinced, okay, that's probably happening. It's just so highly unusual for manatees to eat fish that it was a surprise. Same with the mollusks. I was pretty surprised by that, but I have a student, Christy Nkolo in Gabon, who actually found pieces of shell in manatee feces. And in fact, one of my mentors, Dr. Buddy Powell, who worked in Africa for many years before me, later told me that he also had found pieces of shell in manatee feces. He never published it, and that's why I didn't know about it when I rediscovered it. But so also, obviously, it's important to know what manatees are eating so that we know what habitats we need to protect. So for the mollusks, I really found out that they were eating them when I was working in Angola from 2007 to 2009. This is in a tributary of the Congo River where I was doing interviews. And as you can see, these entire villages are built on top of these clamshells that the people are harvesting and smoking and selling. So every day you have these free divers in their canoes sitting out in the river who literally dive overboard, dive down, scoop up baskets of clams on the bottom that are incredibly numerous in this region and dump them in their boats. And when I started talking to them, they said, oh yeah, the manatees are here with us, diving every day and eating the clams. And it was completely shocking to me. So I was ultimately able to see it. The picture in the lower left is a manatee, the back of a manatee diving in that same region where they were eating clams. So that was pretty amazing discovery, and that is how I actually came back to the US and said to my boss at the time, Buddy Powell, I think they're eating clams. And he said, oh yeah, I saw that in feces in Cote d'Ivoire in the 1980s. And I said, why didn't you tell me? So that was a pretty cool discovery and very unique among Sirenians for them to be eating any kind of mollusk. So I did a stable isotope study as part of my dissertation that we're continuing. I basically went out and collected samples of everything that people told me manatees were eating. And in the upper right-hand corner, you can see some species of fish and catfish and a freshwater mussel from Senegal, the Senegal River, where they reported manatees were eating those things. In the upper left, my student Pascal, who's actually on the call with us today, is documenting different fish species that are taken from nets by fishermen in Cameroon. Basically what he's doing is he's gone to different fishermen and asked them to participate in the study. If they say yes, they get a bucket with preserves in it, and he tells them every time you have a fish in your net that's destroyed by a manatee, go ahead and put it in the bucket and I'll be back in a few weeks. And then he goes back and looks at all the different types of fish. And he and Constant, who are both on the call today, have identified at least 7 new species, possibly more, I'm sorry if I'm getting that wrong, of different fish that manatees are eating in Cameroon. In addition, as I said, freshwater mussels and estuarine clams in the bottom right. That's the Senegal clam from Senegal, very common along the coast. And we see evidence of manatees eating those in submerged sandbars in coastal Senegal. So this was the first stable isotope study for the African manatee, and we basically collected all these samples, and I then, so I should explain for a second what stable isotope means. So in all of our food, and us as well, we have different chemical signatures, particularly carbon and nitrogen signatures based on the food that we eat. And we can see those signatures if we take our hair or a fingernail, and in my case, I took the manatee ear bones that we were already using for aging to look at lifetime diet. And we basically crush some powder from that ear bone and run it through a mass spectrometer, and it basically gives us the carbon and nitrogen content. And then we can run it through some different programs, which tells us, compares it to the food that they're eating and tells us that they're eating that. So the results of my study indicated for the first time that yes, African manatees are truly omnivores. They are not herbivores, at least for the samples we had from Gabon and Senegal, and I suspect other countries as well. And in Senegal, manatees in the Senegal River, as well as the coast, 50% of their diet is fish and mollusks. So that's huge for an animal that's supposed to be an herbivore. In Gabon, we found only 10%, but we had a lot of trouble getting people to tell us different fish species they were eating in Gabon. So I think this is going to be a continuing project, particularly with the work going on in Cameroon, where we're going to learn more about the different fish species there. And then the most recent project that I've been working on is the threat assessment study. This study was basically born out of the fact that for years I would see pictures of manatees being killed, hear about manatees being killed, and it was very disturbing. So I really wanted to do something about it, but it was very hard to persuade any law enforcement in any of these countries to do something. They would say, we don't have enough evidence. So I thought, okay, fine, I will go out and I will get you the evidence. And so I was fortunate to receive a Pew Marine Fellowship, and that project exists in 5 countries right now. And I'll show you those in a moment. But basically, it's a very simple goal. In all 5 of those countries, we are quantifying every single manatee killed over 3 years to finally have accurate numbers of manatees captured and killed by every threat. So outright hunting and poaching, as I said, is the biggest threat. You can see in the middle upper picture, that's a net designed to catch manatees. It's laid across the grassy areas where they feed, and they get a head and a flipper stuck. And unfortunately for them, their reaction to getting stuck is to spin. So they spin in the net, and that further entangles them, and then the hunter comes and gets them. In some countries like Nigeria, they have box traps made of sticks with a trap door, and they bait that with plants that the manatees like to eat. The manatee swims in, the door closes behind them, and then they come along and harpoon it. And so we're not only quantifying traps and actual hunting, but restaurants that serve manatee meat. You can see a manatee stew that was found in Gabon in the lower left corner. as well as other methods. So these are the 5 countries that we're doing this study in: Senegal, Gambia, Nigeria, Cameroon, and the coastal region of DRC. And I want to give a shout out right away to my partners in this study. I'm in Senegal, but I could not be doing this work without all of these fantastic people who have given a huge amount of dedication to this project. So Edemeniang, Uzo Ejimadu, and Johnson Bolaji in Nigeria, Aristide Kamla, Pascal Dimbak, Constant Jassy, and Bridget Edeke in Cameroon. And actually Constant has moved on to Liberia to take a new job, but he had incredible data from the Douala region that we're still using in the project, so he's still part of it. And Samuel Mbungu in DRC, and Dada Sane in the Gambia, and my probably long-suffering and dedicated assistant, Ibrahim Ndong in Senegal. And Ibrahim is holding a whip made from manatee skin in that picture. So basically all of their jobs and my job was to go out and develop the partnerships with local communities and particularly in key fishing communities to try to get year-round information about every time a manatee was caught in a fishing net or killed or captured for any reason. And we're still in phase 1 of this project. It ends next year and we'll move on to the mitigation phase, which I really look forward to because I have to say it's incredibly depressing to open my email every single morning and see so many pictures of dead manatees. But we have learned an amazing amount so far through interview surveys in particular. And we are asking about the past as well as present because we want to look at did hunting or mortality change over time. And as I said, working with year-round monitoring networks for reporting so that if we're not there, we still hear about the manatees being killed. We surf the net for media reports and social media. In a lot of African countries, people either don't know it's illegal to kill a manatee, they don't know it's a manatee, or they don't care. And so they post things on social media and we're able to find those. I mean, a lot of what we found recently for Nigeria has been through Twitter and Facebook. And I do want to point out that actually that has turned out to be a good thing in one way, and that is it caught the attention of the Minister of the Environment in Nigeria, and she's very much on board with helping us to reduce the mortality. And so we're actually going to be, my Nigerian colleagues and I are going to be talking with her next week about ways that we can find some solutions to get the killing to stop in Nigeria. And then of course, opportunistic sample collection when we do have carcasses, and building strong relationships with the wildlife enforcement in each of the countries because we will need them in order to help stop the killing and the captures. And you can see also in the bottom left, there's a picture of manatee sternum bones. Those were collected as somewhat of trophy by a manatee hunter, and he had the dates on them, and so it immediately helps us to understand when he was killing manatees. Because so few people fear prosecution in these countries, we have hunters who will talk to us in a lot of places. Not everywhere, but they will talk to us in quite a few places so we're able to get our information. So for the past year, this is up until last November, so this is the first 2 years of data collection. We've documented over 1,000 manatees killed, and you can see that the vast majority of those are from harpoons. But I'm going to put a little asterisk next to that because not all of those are recent. And bycatch has the 2nd largest cause of mortality, followed by nets that are specifically designed to catch manatees. So bycatch, in our definition, means that it was targeting a different fishery and it caught a manatee. It's not targeting manatees. Manatee net is targeting a manatee. And then other threats such as box traps, dams. Manatees can be killed in dams, either from entrapment or crushed in the dam infrastructure. Tidal stranding is an interesting one. These are when manatees get left on the shore as the tide goes out. In Florida, they will actually willingly do this, particularly female manatees, to avoid mating. And it's possible that African manatees are doing this because they're feeding and they just don't care. And in times gone by, they may have just lay there until the tide came back in, but unfortunately now that makes them a very visible target for hunters. We've had some manatees killed by guns, a couple by machete and watercraft, as well as dredging equipment. Dredging equipment and watercraft are emerging threats. We fortunately have not seen many animals killed by this up until now, but I think with the increasing use of motorized watercraft in a lot of countries, we're going to see that threat increase. And now my screen does not want to go forward. Okay. So when we look at the data by year, you can see that we have in some countries, particularly Senegal and Nigeria, large numbers of reports from earlier decades. And the first four bars there are 10 years of manatee mortality. So everything after that is 1 year. So that you would expect it to be higher. But in some countries, we've been successful at getting people to tell us about past mortality. And then obviously, as people's memories are not as great for going 10 years or more backwards, we have more reports from the present from the different countries. But I do want to point out that we can't always get people to tell us when manatees were killed. So we'll have a fisherman say, my father hunted manatees for 30 years in the 1970s, and he probably killed 120. So we don't actually always know the dates, and this graph is showing you that we only have dates for less than 50% of the manatees so far. So when we break it down by the threats, we find that harpoon again is the largest threat, but what we found for Senegal, although that's such a big number, it was almost all before 1980. And so currently, harpoon is actually a very low threat in Senegal. And so as we get going further with this and we tease these numbers out for publication, we're going to separate out past and present. Harpoon was found in almost every country. I suspect it's in DRC as well, but we just haven't got a record of it yet. We did find bycatch records in every single country, and we did find some variability. For example, dams were only reported killing manatees in Senegal, but we know that in the past some dams have killed manatees in Nigeria as well. And as I mentioned, dredging equipment has been recorded killing manatees in 2 countries. And watercraft, although we only have the one documented for Senegal, there have been watercraft mortalities in Benin and Angola as well. So somewhat better news, some manatees were reported alive, captured, and this is sort of a mix of manatees that were rescued, manatees that escaped while they were being hunted, and some manatees that were captured alive for aquaria, particularly in Asia. And so all of the manatees reported for Senegal have been rescued since 2008. That's good news. Also, the manatees in Nigeria were rescues, but unfortunately both of them died. And all the Cameroonian manatees were those that escaped during capture. And Democratic Republic of the Congo, we have found through CITES records that 16 manatees were captured alive for sale for Asian aquaria since 2013. And 2013 is an important year because that's the year that manatees were uplisted to CITES Appendix I, meaning that they are no longer supposed to be traded for anything other than an emergency. And that's very disturbing that somehow DRC has been trading manatees with Asian aquaria. We also documented some threats that we haven't been able to quantify in terms of dead manatees yet, but we know that these are threats. Weighted log traps, which are really insidious, scary looking trap on the left side there. It's basically a log with a harpoon on the end of it and a trigger so that when the manatee goes into the grass to feed, they are harpooned. And those are decreasing, fortunately, in the Lagos side of Nigeria, but increasing on the eastern side of Nigeria, as reported by my colleagues there. Habitat loss is another big one. So, for example, floodplains lost to agriculture, and in the center upper picture, that's a mangrove area that's being killed to cut the trees for firewood. As well as oil pollution. You know, as most of us know, in Africa, if oil extraction doesn't already exist, as it does in Nigeria, it's coming, as it is in Senegal. And the picture on the lower left is the Niger Delta, where you can see the oil slick on that oxbow and the mangroves. It's terrible for the entire environment, not just the manatees and the mangroves. As well as on the bottom right, invasive plants. This is a picture taken by my former PhD student Aristide Takukam in Lake Assa, which is the most important manatee sanctuary in Cameroon. And just in a couple years, it's been completely invaded by this floating plant, Salvinia molesta, which is not really a manatee food and is blocking all the light out for the food that manatee needs to eat. So they have an ongoing study there to see how that invasive plant is affecting manatee use of that lake. And then also bow and arrow. We found, Ibrahima found a hunter in Senegal who's using bow and arrow to kill manatees. So, sorry, that's all very depressing. So what are our next steps? So our next steps are to analyze all this data and understand where are the most important places to focus for enforcement, and to work with the wildlife enforcement authorities, as well as some nonprofit organizations. Many of you may have heard of the Eagle Network, which is an association of organizations working in, I think, 9 different countries now. We have them in Senegal, and they exist in Cameroon. They do an amazing job. They do undercover operations to catch illegal wildlife trafficking. They then work with the local authorities to get the offenders arrested, and they follow their cases through the courts to make sure they don't bribe their way out. So we work with them, and we're doing the investigative work for them. We plan to hand them our data and tell them where they need to send enforcement. Obviously, we want to raise public awareness through the media and publicize those arrests to make people understand this is illegal and not something they should be doing. And we also hope to increase alternative livelihood programs in protected areas and address different threats in different countries. So one thing we've learned, for example, is dams are a big problem in Senegal, but dams are actually pretty easy to fix because we can work with the management authorities to retrofit a dam so that it no longer kills a manatee. And so we're actually already working on that with the authorities in Senegal on 2 different dams. But for example, illegal hunting in Nigeria is going to be an enormous problem to tackle. We've had some early successes. There was a rescue of a mother and calf manatee in Senegal by the Water and Forestry and the Department of Fisheries in 2018. Just did it on their own. We're very proud of them. They took them from an area where they were trapped and released them back to the Senegal River. And there was a manatee hunter arrested in Togo a few years ago who had been hunting manatees for upwards of 30 years. So hoping to make some more examples of people like that so that we can make people realize there are consequences. And I do want to point out, we have tried to start some alternative livelihood programs already. This is Dunson Bolaji in Nigeria. We received a grant a few years ago from the Save Our Species Fund to implement 3 alternative livelihood programs. We had one in Nigeria, one in Senegal, and one in Mali. And I'm just going to highlight the Nigeria one. Bolaji has a fisheries background, and so he basically proposed to start catfish cage aquaculture as an alternative livelihood for manatee hunters, and it did an amazing job. In the community where he worked, which is the Ise community on Lekki Lagoon outside of Lagos, and honestly, I can't believe there's a manatee still left in the Lagos area with 21 million people and all of the users on these different lagoon systems. But in the year before the study began, 132 manatees were killed by that community. And so basically he went in and said, you need to show me your traps. We're going to GPS mark the traps. We're going to take them down. And in return, I'm going to give you all the materials and teach you how to build these floating PVC fish traps. We're going to provide you the fingerlings and teach you how to raise these catfish to market size, sell them, and then continue on. So fertilize eggs and create the next round of fish. And so they did that, and the first year they were able to sell over 1 ton of a native catfish in the lagoon. Unfortunately, we did learn the hard way about some unanticipated problems. For example, storms came and washed away some people's traps. We also had what they called bad water come down during one point of the year that killed a lot of the fish. And so once a farmer lost his fish, he hadn't put the money by to restock. And so we've learned a lot from this, and we're hoping to implement this program. We have a lot of interest, not only from that community, but surrounding communities as well, and from other countries. As I mentioned, when we hear about manatees that need to be rescued, we try our best to do that. All of our rescues to date have been either calves that are orphaned and left alone. A manatee calf cannot survive without its mother. It needs the milk, and it needs to know where to go to find the resources it needs. In Florida, a manatee calf will stay with its mom for 2 years. We don't know in Africa how long the calf is dependent, but we guess it's at least a year and possibly longer. And so when we find these very small young animals without their mom, we've tried to rescue them. The picture on the upper left is a calf named Victor, who was found on the beach, the Atlantic Ocean beach in Gabon in 2010. And we were able to successfully raise him in a lagoon enclosure in a Banyo lagoon in southern Gabon. And that's actually him also in the bottom left, just before he was released back to the wild at the age of 3. It was a huge challenge to get the supplies he needed to that remote corner of the world. They don't just drink cow's milk, they need a special milk formula with vitamins that had to be shipped in, and then we had to transition him from a bottle to eating plants. So it was a huge effort involving a lot of people to get that manatee to releasable size. In the upper middle, we also had a calf rescued in Nigeria. That's Edem Eniong in the center, rescuing a calf that mother was killed and the calf was put in a village well. Unfortunately, he did not learn about it until 2 weeks later, and it had suffered so much dehydration that it ultimately didn't survive, which was really a shame. But Edem did Herculean things to try to keep that calf alive. And we have no facilities for African manatees right now anywhere in Africa. So if we do a rescue, either the animal has to be released on site or we have to dream something up. Victor lived in a bathtub for the first week after his rescue. So that's something we need to think about in the future, is how can we get some facilities to rehabilitate injured manatees in Senegal. The second case for rescues is fisheries bycatch when they are reported. And so the upper right picture of the 2 adult manatees, they were both entangled in a fisherman's net in the Joal Marine Protected Area where they weren't supposed to be fishing anyway. And we were able to successfully rescue those animals and release them in a safe place. And then on the lower right, a juvenile manatee caught in a fishing net was released by the community in Lac de Guiers in northern Senegal. So fortunately, those animals aren't badly injured if they're caught in nets and they survive, and we can let them go right away. Since I started working in Africa, as I said, I realized very quickly I wasn't going to be doing this alone, and I felt very strongly that I needed other Africans to be joining in this conservation effort. So I've led training workshops over the years, covering people from 19 different countries. I started out with sort of 2-week trainings and then moved on to longer term training for graduate students. Mentor Manatee was a program funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a 3-year program for graduate students and professionals. And you can see my 8-member team there from Cameroon, Gabon, and DRC in the upper right that spent 3 years with me, and a bunch of those guys are on the call today. So the goal was to help them to have funding for their fieldwork projects while they were graduate students and support them in ways that their university couldn't. So teach them how to write a scientific publication, present scientific material, either a poster or a spoken presentation, you know, lots of different things, how to talk to the media, and then just, you know, how to do their manatee projects so that they could become successful professionals. And, you know, I'm really thankful that pretty much all of them are still working in the conservation realm right now. And most of the folks in that picture who did a master's degree have moved on to PhDs, so that's fantastic. We've also been able to inspire some protected areas, particularly in Benin and the Oeme River. And also just providing some basic field equipment like binoculars, tents, life jackets, and other things to field researchers in different countries. And as I said, I've primarily moved on to graduate students, so I want to highlight some of the fantastic efforts going on by graduate students right now. From the upper left, you have Yassine Guy from Senegal, who's studying African manatees in Lac de Guiers for the very first time. That's the largest lake in Senegal. It's 70 kilometers long, and we're finding almost no hunting in that lake, which is fantastic. In the center, we have Bridget Iduke in Cameroon, who's working in the newest national park in Cameroon, Camp Oman, to study African manatee threats and habitat use. On the upper right, Clinton Factow, he's on the call with us today, is studying African manatee acoustics as well as genetics, and very exciting for them. They just recorded their very first African manatee recordings in Cameroon, in Lac Ossa. So if you go to our Facebook page, which I'll have at the end of my talk, you can actually click on the link to hear the African manatee vocalization. On the bottom left, on the right, is Uzoma Ejmaju from Nigeria, who's working to stop hunting in Nigeria. That's him with 2 hunters. He's trying to educate not to kill manatees, and unfortunately a dead manatee. He's also looking at cranial morphometrics of African manatees. And in the center, Christy Nkolo in Gabon, who's looking at manatee habitat use in the different lagoons. And finally, Sarah Farinelli, who's looking at different technologies to better detect manatees in Africa, including aerial and underwater drones and side scanning sonar and remote imaging cameras. So a lot more work going on than when I first started many years ago, and I'm really inspired. This doesn't even count a bunch of students who've already graduated, like Aristide Kamla and Pascal Dimbat, who are all doing amazing work in their countries. We do educational outreach programs right now in about 5 different countries, and these include school programs for kids. We do programs in different villages. We have coloring books. We have a manatee costume, which you can see in the boat in the upper left, that the kids can put on and become the manatee. They move through an obstacle course of threats to manatees, like trash and nets, and even someone jumping out with a harpoon to scare them. And we have posters, stickers, and we also have project painting murals on public spaces. So this one pictured is in Cameroon, so that as people walk by every single day, they're reminded that manatees are important. And I just really like to say that, you know, this program, I'm happy to lead it, but I certainly couldn't do it without so many amazing colleagues, only a few of whom I've mentioned today, who are so integral to this project. And I'm really hopeful for the future in Africa because of all the participation of so many different people, as well as amazing funding from so many different funders who we're grateful for, particularly in this era of difficult funding. And a lot of it is springboarded from my Puberine Fellowship, and so I'm very thankful for that as well. And I'd just like to give at the very end here a little bit of a plug. If you're interested how you can help our organization and help our work, please tell everybody about us, tell your friends and family. We do have Facebook and Twitter pages. And we also have a website where you're welcome to learn more about all our programs and donate at africanaquaticconservation.org. So thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, first of all, this was so amazing and inspiring. I really got goosebumps when you started talking about all the work the local people are doing, the education of the program in these countries. I think that is super, super important and interesting. I could say so many things more because I'm just overwhelmed right now, but I think I go straight to my question. After saying, of course, congratulations on everything you have done, you're doing, and all your partners and all the people working with you are doing. So Lucy, my question, do you know anything about the historical range of the African manatee? So if the distribution was going also more into Central Africa, South Africa, how that looked like maybe?
We don't believe that the coastal range was any different than it is today because they really do rely on fresh water. So even if they live in salt water, they must drink fresh water to survive. And that means they've got to find either a river or a spring. And in coastal central Senegal and Guinea-Bissau, we have a large network of freshwater springs. So they can actually live out on the seagrass beds and drink from freshwater springs without ever going into inland. But in Central Africa, we don't know of those kinds of springs. So, but the main limiting factor is that once you get into southern Angola, as you probably know, you hit the Skeleton Coast and the Namib Desert, and there is no fresh water. So they probably could not get past that to get to the rivers in South Africa. It's, their travel range is roughly 150 kilometers. And so they just never made it further south. And similarly in the north, there are no rivers north of the Senegal River, so they couldn't get further north in the Sahel and Sahara. So coastally, they're probably the same as historically. Inland is a different story. The Lake Chad actually did have manatees once upon a time, but sadly, as most people know, Lake Chad is drying and is just a figment of its former self at this point. And so it's believed there were no manatees as early as 1929. They are gone from Lake Chad. And a more recent researcher in the 1990s found them gone from the entire watershed, all the rivers associated with Lake Chad. The only place manatees still exist in Chad is Lakes Trene and Lere, and they are actually heavily hunted there. So it's a it's a place that I fear for them, I should say. And we actually have tried to get research going there over several different times, and either the person leaves or the situation is so challenging there. I mean, there's Boko Haram in the area now. There's a lot of challenges to working there. I can't go there, it's not safe. So I am actually hoping to get a couple of Chadian researchers to do some work there. But those are really the only places I know that they existed historically, that they no longer exist. But again, the range is so enormous with so many little rivers and tributaries that we may not know about, that they may have existed in some other rivers that they don't today. But for the most part, for all the big ones, they're still there.
Okay, we have Natalie Mastic. Natalie, you have a question?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Lucy. That was a really great talk. I had a question about the causes of mortality. It seemed like most of them were anthropogenic. Have you noticed any instances of disease?
Oh, that's a good question. We haven't actually. So I should point out that our threat assessment is primarily focusing on anthropogenic threats, but we would of course document anything. Well, we document them even when we don't know the cause of death, for example. And we do have a certain number of manatees that were dead that we have no idea why they died. But disease is not super prevalent in manatees in general. They do get some parasites, and they do get a form of herpes that's been documented in the Florida manatee. But so far in Africa, we haven't discovered any diseases. I guess that's one good thing in their favor.
They haven't got old enough.
Sorry?
They haven't got old enough to get diseases.
Oh, well, actually, I think 39 is pretty old, and I bet there's some older ones out there.
Yeah, sure.
Not that I want any to die, but I want to find an older ear bone.
Lucy, there's a question in the chat.
Oh.
Yeah, I'll just raise it. It's Luan Johnson. The question is, which other mammal species allow for aging by ear bone?
Ah, wow. Well, fish, of course. The otolith is the ear bone of fish. And outside of the other manatees, I'm not really that sure, I have to be honest. I think the technique that was developed for manatees, that was done by Dr. Miriam Montel for her dissertation many years ago for Florida manatees, and now she's using with Amazonian manatees, came from thinking about fish otoliths and the rings in the fish otoliths that they can count for aging. And she actually tried many different bones before she was able to prove that the rings are annual in manatees. And I'll just throw out that we're not really sure why they're annual. We know that, well, when we first started aging African manatee ear bones, I was wondering if we were going to find rings, because if I thought, well, if it has to do with the cold season, hot season in Florida, because they tend to feed more in the summer months, then we're not going to find them in Africa. But in fact, we did, and so that means something else is causing those annual layers, and we're not really sure what does. But that's a different question. Sorry. So, sorry. Yeah, I don't know other than fish.
What about, I wonder if anybody's looked at elephants or some of these other things in that same order or a group, or
I don't know. I mean, so elephants and manatees both have what we call marching molars, where they literally they wear down the front teeth and they lose them as they go through life and replace them from the back. Somewhat like sharks, only less frequently. So a manatee's tooth journey lasts about 7 years in its mouth, and they lose that tooth. And elephants can replace their teeth also. That's why we can't age them by teeth like you can for a dolphin or a whale. But I don't know the answer if that's how they're aging elephants at all. Sorry.
That's all right.
Thank you very much.
Marty, Marty Jasper. Marty always has a question. Marty.
Thanks very much. Yeah, very interesting talk. I posted in the chat that I'm interested to find out about something I know literally nothing about. So I think most of us are probably in the same boat there. But yeah, for me, the sort of resemblance is very close to a walrus. And if I were to look at them, I would have said that would be something that's related to them more than an elephant or any of the other things. So I mean, yeah, I don't know how far away are they from a walrus. They look like a walrus that had its tusks removed.
They're pretty far from pinnipeds in general, because seals, sea lions, and walrus all descended from a carnivorous ancestor, and manatees all and elephants all descended from an herbivorous ancestor. So they're pretty far, actually. They're not closely related at all.
But like physically, they actually look very similar. Besides the tusks, do they also have those sort of whiskers as a walrus does?
They do have the vibrissae, which they use similarly to the walrus to feel the bottom and feel things, and they're very tactile, just like walruses. But I would say that that's convergent evolution. They just both evolved that feature from their whiskers. It's not something that makes them related particularly.
Just interesting, as you say, how they sort of two things almost ended up looking the same, but from a different whatever origin, and then in terms of like skeletally, are they quite similar to the walrus, or?
Not really. They lost their back legs about 50 million years ago, so they don't have, in fact, they just have a remnant bone where their pelvis used to be, where they used to have back legs, and develop that tail. So the pelvic bone is vestigial. They just are, if you saw them in a museum, the skeletons are quite different. Another interesting thing about manatees is that they have solid rib bones. They're literally solid. There's no air spaces in there. They're not soft and spongy. Like if you cut into one of our rib bones, you would see air pockets where, in fact, blood is while we're alive. Manatees have these very, what they're called paculostellaric, I can never say that, but solid rib bones. And that actually allows them to beach themselves and be okay on land. So when they beach themselves at the edge of a river to grab a plant, they're okay, whereas a dolphin that beaches itself is actually experiencing difficulty breathing because its body is collapsing under its own weight on the shore. So they're different. Now, pinnipeds, like a walrus, they would have those kind of spongy rib bones as well. So their skeleton's quite different too.
Okay. And giving birth, if they don't have a pelvis, out of interest, I mean, yeah, I don't know, is it in the same normal way, or? Yeah.
Well, underwater, but yes.
Okay,
they're underwater.
Very interesting.
There's a question by Campbell Scott. I just want to ask if you, Campbell, I'm unmuting you, please, and thank you. And then after you, there's Anikan Abassi. I think that's a question in the chat. Campbell, over to you, please.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Lucy. That was awesome. Absolutely awesome talk. Yeah, I must say, just a few years ago, I took my kids to Disney World, and part of my motivation was go to Crystal Springs, which I bartered time with my kids to have the opportunity to go and spend some time there with manatees. It was absolutely, it was mind blowing. So I think that the work that you're doing is awesome. I'd very much like to meet you in person and have longer discussions. But what I'd like to know, where are the core conservation areas that we should be concentrating on in West Africa? So, I mean, not just necessarily the river systems, but where, there must be areas where we can start where these nucleus populations need to be conserved. So where do we start? I mean, I understand that there's two separate populations that we're looking at, but where, the problem is the river systems, they're highly abused, they, highly in demand. How do we deal with it? How do we start with creating that population? So, in an event where, these populations are lost outside this nucleus area, they can be repopulated. Where are those core areas of ideal habitat that we need to conserve? Where do we put the money? Where do we put the dollars?
Well, I think, looking at all the different genetic diversity, we have to preserve a lot of places for starters, because you can't take a manatee out of the Senegal River and plop it in Central Africa. It won't survive. It won't know what to do. It's feeding on different things. And so, it means that we need to preserve a lot of different habitats and as well as populations. And, I think there's a lot of different things that influence the work that we do. For example, I naively started this thinking, I'm gonna work to get something going in all 21 countries. And what I realize is we're still at the point where really being able to do something effective to save manatees is highly dependent on the individual motivation in that country. We're still dependent on individuals. We need more people to be trained and more organizations to be involved, because right now, if something were to happen to me in Senegal or Ibrahima, that would be it for Senegal. We had a terrible loss in Cote d'Ivoire where the researcher who had been working there for 30 years died of tuberculosis, and that entire project is gone. He never trained anybody to follow in his footsteps, and so there is nobody today in Cote d'Ivoire working on manatees, and that's such a shame. We lost 30 years of information. He didn't publish it, and so I'm sort of getting off the track a bit here, but I really think that we have to work harder, as hard as we can, to get as many people involved and many organizations so that knowledge can be passed down. In terms of the manatees themselves, I think it's really important to preserve places with great habitat. Gabon is a great example. Very little hunting there, tons of coastal lagoons. They've been trying for years to improve their tourism. You can actually see on a daily basis from a boat. We had 7 to 10 sightings a day in some of the lagoons I was working on. They have national parks in all the right places. So the problem right now is it's very difficult to get to Gabon, and there isn't a lot of infrastructure in the country once you get there for tourism. So, that's a great place. Also Guinea-Bissau, the Bijagos Archipelago, which is spectacularly beautiful. The 60 offshore islands, not only for manatees, but humpback dolphins and nesting sea turtles, is an amazing place with likely a very high population that we should be working harder to protect. We're trying to do some stuff in the Senegal River. My husband and I started a protected area in Lac de Guerre that I didn't really touch upon very much today, but we're trying to help them develop tourism, community-based tourism there. And so, I think the places that they're going to get protected are the places where we can get some infrastructure in and get people to care about them, frankly. There's, and then at the opposite end of the spectrum, the places I worry about the most, where I really worry we're going to lose manatees, are places like Chad and Nigeria, actually Sierra Leone, because manatees get into rice fields. The rice fields are all connected to rivers for irrigation, and manatees get in them and they kill the manatees in retaliation. So, there's heavy manatee culture in that country. That actually also happens in parts of Nigeria as well. So, you know, that's the bad news. There's a lot of places we have to think, are we going to lose them in this entire country if we don't do something soon? Then there's sort of the good places that, you know, let's do something where we can educate more people and they can maybe have an opportunity to see manatees. There are only 2 places in Africa right now that I can pretty much guarantee if you went there, you'd see a manatee. One is Lake Assa, Cameroon, and the other is a place called Point St. George on the Casamance River in Senegal that has a little observation tower, and they have a spring right in front of that tower, and every day during the dry season, manatees come there to drink. We saw 12 manatees in one morning there, and so, you know, and I've seen them there over many years, so they're definitely coming. So, you know, those are places I'm really trying to help. And also my colleague Aristide in Cameroon has done an amazing job with Lake Assa. They have tours if you want to go there and go out in the boat and see manatees, you can do that. So we're working on it. Everything takes longer than we want to, but you know, that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, we have a question from Anikan Vasi or what?
I know.
Anikan, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yep, I know him from Nigeria.
Hello, Lucy.
Hi, Uwat. How are you?
Yeah, that's a good presentation there.
Good.
Quite impressive to hear from you once again. And of course, we've walked around and we've seen some of the traits. And then it bothers me that if we see them, we talk to them, and nothing really happens. They continue to hunt. So my question is, we've seen the traits like Nigeria, Senegal has the highest of fatality when it comes to manatee. So I want to know what are your plans towards reducing this number of fatality, or maybe think poverty, you know, misinformation.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry, you're breaking up a little bit, but I think you're asking what our plans are to reduce the mortality. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, this has to come from below as well as above. I mean, people have to be educated and understand that they're an important animal to protect. One thing that you probably know, but others may not, is that in areas where we have manatees, we have more fish, particularly in freshwater systems, and that is because baby fish eat manatee feces because they're primarily eating plants and they process those plants. Feces are a food for baby fish, and we've actually shown that in the refuge we started in Senegal, that outside the refuge they have more fish now. So that's how we can kind of, if you will, sell protection to people who otherwise say, what good are they, who cares? And so we want to be doing more education, more public awareness programs, public service announcements, kind of things, to make people aware of what they are, that they are protected and that they're important, that it's a big cycle. You know, if you have more manatees, you have more fish. If you have more fish, you have more plants. If you have more plants, you have more manatees. It sort of works in a big circle. And so that's one of the ways. And then also trying to work with the government agencies, particularly wildlife enforcement agencies, because I honestly believe that for a lot of these threats, they're not going to stop until people feel that there's a risk of punishment, a risk of arrest. And that's the unfortunate reality with humanity. And until they feel that there's some threat to them, they're going to keep doing it. And I understand that a lot of people are poor, they need protein in their diets. Manatees are big, and when you kill one, it can feed an entire village. I understand all of that, but I also understand that this is an important animal to protect for the future. So we have to find alternatives for people so that they have a way to have a livelihood so that they don't kill them.
Thanks very much, Lucy. There's John Wright who would like to ask a question. Just want to say to everybody, we're going to set it now in a way that you can unmute yourself when you want to ask a question. We now at the part where we formally close the session after an hour and a half, and people who want to stay on and chat away and ask their questions, welcome to do so and unmute yourselves and ask questions. But again, to you, Lucy, your team, I can just give you my felicitation for incredible work done. And again, a round of applause to you for you and your team for the wonderful work you are doing. Thank you. John Wright.
There's also some questions in the chat that I just want to answer quickly because there's 3 questions in a row. Sabine asks, what about crocodiles? Are they preying on them? The answer is no. But in reverse, there have been some sublethal attacks on manatees from crocodiles. There's been at least a couple manatees in Central Africa that are seen with bite marks from crocodiles. Bianca asks if they can get a strain of COVID. As far as I know, the answer is no. And Rhonda asks, how long can they remain on land breathing? And that's a great question. Because of their strong rib bones, they can remain on land indefinitely as long as they are kept cool and wet and comfortable and don't experience things like overheating. So, for example, when we rescue a manatee, as long as we keep it on foam mat and cover it with wet towels and pour water on it, we can transport it for hours. They do regularly in Florida do it that way during manatee rescues. So it's, as I said, not like a dolphin where they need to be in water. So that's a good thing, I guess, for them. So
thank you. John? John, we can't hear you. 1 second, please.
John, there's something wrong with your microphone. You're not coming through, John.
Can you hear me?
Now we can, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, that was a fantastic presentation. I just had 3 questions. Number 1, are they manatees found upstream in the Congo River? Or I know there's the falls. I don't know whether they go up into the Congo. Number 2, how do they interact with hippos, if at all? And number 3, are they likely to be divided in the future? Some large widespread species are divided into 2. Do you see that happening with manatees? Their different subpopulations? Thank you.
great questions. And I just blanked on the first one. Okay, let me answer the hippo one. They are seen with hippos and have been documented many times with hippos, actually. We're not really sure what's going on under the water there, but they seem to get along. They seem to spend time together. To me, a manatee kind of looks like a hippo without the back legs, or any legs, really. And so we don't know what interactions they have. It's a little too dangerous to get in the water with the hippo. But we do know that they spend time together. So that's an interesting question, and we'd really like to find out more about the hippos. And then the genetics question about, are they likely to be split? I just have to take a wild guess because we really don't have enough data yet for the nuclear DNA that we will need to split them into different subspecies, which I think it's not going to be a species level split. I think it's going to be a subspecies split. And I do actually think that ultimately there will be enough data to say that there is a central African manatee that extends up potentially as far as Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, and then a different subspecies in the other northern countries. It just seems like the modeling that we're doing is so clear cut that they're different, but we just don't have enough information yet, even from the mitochondrial DNA, to split them into subspecies. But after years of telling people there's only one African manatee, not just a West African manatee, if I have to then say, oh, in fact, there now are 2, it's going to be kind of interesting. But anyway, I'm sorry, what was the first question? I remember.
Do they go up the Congo?
Oh, yes. That's a very interesting question because there is some I don't know. So right now they would not be able to ascend, obviously, because of the rapids and the falls that are, you know, huge, right around the area of the Inga Dam that they're building. It's not possible for a manatee to forge those kinds of rapids. However, I mean, they are above rapids in the Niger River and got up there millions of years ago. So these river systems change. And we know that the rapids in the lower Congo River actually aren't that old, geologically speaking. My former boss and mentor, Buddy Powell, really wanted to believe that there were manatees in the upper Congo River, but never found any of them. However, he said that there's a name for them in some local languages up there, meaning they probably did exist at one time if they don't today. John Hart, who works with in the Lomami National Park way up there, has never heard of them there. So he's the only person I've really ever talked to who's spent any real time up there, and says that they have never heard of them up in the Congo River above the falls.
Okay, are there any more questions?
And I just want to, yeah, I'm sorry, Hella, I just want to take this one opportunity. Constance made a comment that he's right. I want to point out that another way that we are trying to help stop manatee hunting is to engage the women in manatee conservation, because they are the ones who often process the manatee meat and sell it. And that is a critically important sector that we need to be addressing to stop killing manatees, is women who are vendors and processors of manatee meat. Okay.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's an interesting talk coming next month with Greta Ayora, who works engaging women in Ethiopia, and this is up her alley. And yeah, I actually gave her your contacts to get in touch with you, but so she should be contacting you at some point. Yeah. Any more questions?
Rod, I just want to check. Hella Linkmeyer, are you applauding, or would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, I would like to ask.
Hella, 1 second. We just have to unmute you. 1 second. Just unmute yourself, Hella, please.
Yes, unmuted.
Yes,
there you go.
We can hear you, Hella.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Lucy, for this amazing talk on this challenging research and fruitful research that you've been conducting all these years in all these different countries. Now, I have a question, and I would like to go across to another continent, to South America. I might have missed that if you talked about the manatees in other countries. Do you have any knowledge of manatees in South America? For example, I was in Colombia, and traveling on the river Magdalena, they spoke about a kind of animal that looked like, I think they called it a river calf or something. So speaking about the manatee, I thought, was that a manatee?
Yes. That's what it was, especially if they call it a river cow, because they're known as sea cows. And so I'm not really surprised if they're calling it a river cow there. In Portuguese, it would be peixe boi, which means woman fish, which goes back to the mermaid myths. Yes, so Colombia is a particularly important place. I mentioned early on in the talk that the original ancestor of all of the Sirenians, the proto-Sirenians, evolved in what was the Tethys Sea at the top of Africa about 55 million years ago, but then they spread out across the Atlantic all the way to, as far as we know, Jamaica at least. And in fact, in their evolution, there were many, many species of dugongs. At one time in the Caribbean, there were 35 different species of dugong that were all different kinds of root specialists, nearshore dugongs, deeper water dugongs, and all kinds of variations on the theme. And that all changed about 3 to 5 million years ago when the Isthmus of Panama closed and changed ocean circulation around the globe. A lot of those seagrasses that the dugongs were feeding on died out, and the dugongs themselves died out. Meanwhile, in South America, the ancestors of manatees had started to evolve in a giant inland sea that was there millions of years ago, but we lost that sea when the Andes Mountains rose. And those manatees spread out in today what is the Amazon and also into Colombia. And if you look at research with West Indian manatees, it's highly likely that Colombia is the birthplace of what we have as today's West Indian manatees ancestors, and also the ancestor of the African manatee probably evolved in that Colombia region. And so how did they get to Africa? Well, my thesis work looked at African manatees, compared them to all the other manatees, and who are they most closely related to? And it came out to manatees in sort of the top part of South America, so northern Brazil and countries I'm completely blanking the names on right now, but basically on the top part of the South American continent. And so and then we know from divergence dating work that we did that they came over to Africa 3 to 5 million years ago. So again, all this stuff was happening as the Isthmus of Panama closed, the ocean circulation changed. It was also, the Pleistocene was also the hottest period in the recent Earth's history, where there's actually been a lot of study done to look at how the Earth was during the last super hot period, to look at what climate change may be doing today. So fortunately for me, there's a lot of research, so ocean sediment cores and modeling of ocean currents from that time period. And what I found is that that northeast countercurrent that I showed you that bumps into Africa right at that corner of Sierra Leone and Liberia strengthened during that time period 3 to 5 million years ago when the Earth was very warm. And it came right off that top part of South America and shunted right across to Africa. And it shifted, it shifts during different years based on different currents, different temperatures. It lessens in cooler periods. And so one of my hypotheses, which I'm still trying to test, is that did the different populations of manatees that exist today originate from that current pushing manatees across, and some got deposited north of the hump of Africa up in the northern part, and some got shunted into the Gulf of Guinea and moved down along the coast. And it's very feasible that that current could have brought live manatees across, because modeling suggests that a buoy dropped in the water off South America could travel all the way to the African continent in about 35 days. So it's possible that that's how manatees got to Africa. And I think it's likely, given that their closest relatives today are those manatees in that same region.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. I'm just checking the screen.
I would like to ask a question, if you don't mind. I've got a friend on here who might know the fossil record. Do you know anything about the fossil record of Pippa Haraf? Are you awake?
Yes, I am.
Pippa, have you got any records of manatees in the fossil records in Southern Africa?
No, not that I know of. No.
No dugongs either.
Yeah. No dugongs. No.
Okay.
But
Thanks,
I've got a question. What noises do they make? I've got.
Yes, I'm sorry. I saw your question in the chat. So they make a series of high-pitched squeaks and chirps. So when they're just talking to each other, they don't echolocate like dolphins. Their vocalizations are entirely voluntary for communicating. And so when they're just chatting with each other, they'll make a series of chirpy noises, kind of like, and when they're scared, they'll make a very high-pitched squeal, like, so that's primarily Florida manatees, but you know, actually, as I mentioned, my colleagues in Cameroon have literally just gotten the first recorded sounds of wild African manatees in Lake Assa, and they've published it on their website, which I can actually stand by. I will provide the link right here in the chat, so anyone who wants to copy it can. Give me a second, I have to get to Facebook to get it. Where are we here? But anyway, you can hear it. And Clinton, who's, well, he was on the call, I'm not sure if he's still here, is actually looking at these vocalizations and also chewing sounds to try to figure out how long their feeding bouts last, where they're feeding, and looking at the areas of Lake Asa where the invasive plants are versus where they are not, in order to try to understand if the manatees are using the areas where there's invasive plants. So here we go. So that's the link. Hold on. Ooh, why did I do that? That's the link. It's in French, but if you scroll around, you'll see sort of a video you can click on to hear the manatee vocalizations.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Thank you, Lucy.
Oh, there's Clinton raising his hand, so maybe he can tell us more.
Clinton, we are unmuting you if you can just accept. Seeing your hand, Marty, but
Clinton went for a bicycle ride.
Yeah, I saw him driving on his bicycle. Hello, Clinton.
Hey, Clinton, how you doing?
Hello, everyone. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, so I was riding a bicycle. I went to quickly look for something to eat because here in Lake Osa, things get closed at 8 p.m. So I rushed to look for something to eat.
Wonderful.
Okay, so we've registered the first African Manatee vocalization ever here in Lake Osa, and it's so exciting. And we got hundreds of Manatee vocalizations so far, and we're actually preparing a paper on it.
Yes. And Clinton, as I said, will be doing more for his PhD as well as this first paper.
That is awesome. That really is awesome.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Go ahead, Campbell.
Campbell, and then Marty, and then
bioacoustics, extremely interested in it. So my question is that normally high frequency is close contact communication, and generally base. So your calls are for long distance. So have you picked up any deep base calls yet, or is it all high frequency? Have you picked up any low frequency calls yet? Because I'm almost certain that there will be. There has to be.
Actually, we are using two types of hydrophones. The Resemble, which is unfortunately limited to a sample weight of like 10 kilohertz. And we are also using the LS1 hydrophone, which has a broader sample weight that extends to up to 22 kilohertz. So so far we've got vocalizations of up to 8, 9, 10 kilohertz. But we got some, from the spectrograms, from the analysis of the spectrograms, we noticed that we were losing some harmonics. So it's quite feasible that African manatees have ultrasonic vocalizations. So we need a more broader sample weight, a more broader sample weight hydrophone to confirm that.
I stand corrected here, but I'm just thinking with like base elephants. I think it's 1 hertz, 2 hertz. So we're talking very, very low rumbles and bass. I mean, obviously water is a very interesting medium, and high frequency or all sound travels a lot further. And of course, like the whales and what have you, I mean, they use it. But it's interesting within a riverine environment where there's a lot of plants and there's a lot of cover, if you wanted to communicate a bit further, you would need to use a lot more bass to get out and travel and let it bounce off, because high frequency sounds would dissipate quickly. That's my understanding.
Yeah, sure. In fact, manatees in general have high frequencies vocalizations due to the marine environment. Particularly, I suspect African manatee will have a higher frequency vocalizations since the environment, they live in very turbid waters, and they rely mostly on their vocalization to keep contact, specifically the mother-calf contact. So vocalization are a very important factor for manatees.
Fascinating. Excellent work.
Clinton. Thanks, Campbell. Marty, I think you're probably the last person to ask question.
Thanks, sir. Rod always says I've got one, and he's lied. I've normally got two, so.
Gad 3.
You and Campbell both guilty.
Okay, I'll own the badge. Just the one thing that you mentioned that I found very interesting, you said that there's that spring that they go and drink fresh water in, and I was like, what do you mean they're drinking fresh water? They're in the water. So they actually go and find a source of fresh drinking water, which, yeah, I mean, it is quite an amazing kind of concept or thought to have. But how susceptible are they then to pollution in the rivers? Because I mean, I think most of the threats that you spoke about were hunting and similar sort of, you know, physical damage, as opposed to rivers being polluted and possibly fish numbers dropping or plants dropping, and therefore the manatees being at risk. I'm just interested in whether that isn't a possible threat from pollution.
That's a great question. So you're right, I should have clarified. So the freshwater springs are within saline environments. So in Senegal, we have a limestone base, you know, crust is a limestone base with pores, and we actually have a huge network of freshwater springs percolating up from the water table under saline systems like mangrove channels and the nearshore coast. So for example, in the Joel Fatty Youth Marine Protected Area right in front of my house, there are a minimum of 14 springs that we know of. And they're not big. In fact, you can't even see a boil at the surface most of the time. But basically they're known because of manatee hunters used to see that manatees congregated in these places, so they would go there to hunt them. And that's really how we've learned about most of the springs. But there's hundreds. I mean, Bamboung National Park at the border of Gambia has at least 22 springs that are known. And I'm not sure how far south they go, but they go into Guinea, and they do extend out to the Bijagos Islands. So, you know, the Bijagos Islands are more than 25 miles off the coast of Guinea-Bissau, yet manatees can live there full time because of these freshwater springs in the mangrove channels. So it's kind of a fascinating ecosystem that they can do. But in terms of pollution, you know, I think that pollution is probably an emerging threat also, particularly things like agricultural runoff in rivers. Constant can tell you he actually had a water testing kit that we got for him because when he was working in Lake Asa, there's an oil palm plantation up on the sort of steep embankment overlooking that lake, and we were worried about you know, eutrophication, nitrogen, and just runoff from this huge oil palm plantation into the lake. So as you know, urban environments grow, manatees tend to move out when there's too much human disturbance. So if there's a larger city, I mean, that's why I'm so shocked that they're even still around Lagos, because I mean, it's just such a huge city with so many users on the water, and probably the water is not particularly clean. You know, you can imagine sewage isn't probably as well treated as it could be as it goes in the water, et cetera, et cetera. It's amazing that there are manatees. However, you know, in Florida, there was a manatee once rescued from the sewer system under the Miami airport. And it was nicknamed Sewer Sam. So manatees can live in some pretty gross water if they want to. But, you know, again, harmful chemicals over long periods of time, not good for anybody. And we do worry about it in Lac de Guiers as well, because there's an enormous sugarcane plant. There's sunflower farming, and obviously a lot of agricultural runoff. So it's something that needs to be studied and that we need to watch as it increases.